When looking into DC Comics and its history with Hollywood, I began with the idea of mainly encompassing what live-action television shows and movies were aired or released. And by movies, I mean feature-length films. One of those who left a comment on the first video on this series reminded me that there was a time when Hollywood used to include shorts and serials before feature films, sometimes animated. In that, I was remiss to mention that DC had a fair few of both kinds of these films produced as far back as 1971's Superman, also known as The Mad Scientist. It was the beginning of a series of 17 animated shorts and was so wildly popular that it was nominated for the 1942 Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. The series ran until 1943's Secret Agent. I also did not mention all of the attempts at producing DC shows and films that either failed or never aired. The reasons were probably obvious. The most notorious of such projects would be Superman Lives, with Nicolas Cage starring as Superman, that went through production hell between 1996 and 1998, before being scrapped a few weeks before filming was to begin. It was so infamous that an enthralling documentary was made titled The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened? And Kevin Smith made a decent living for a time retelling his part on the project on comedy tours at college campuses. The first part of this series was called The Beginning for obvious reasons. DC was finding their footing where television and feature films were concerned. I left off last time hinting that Linda Carter would quickly be dethroned as the best example for how to do live-action comic book characters right in that early era. In that, I may have oversold it because upon further thought on the subject, I think there is room to debate that. Linda Carter was superb in her dual role as Diana Prince and Wonder Woman. In 1978, her competition hit theaters in the form of Christopher Reeve's Superman. With a rather disappointing Margot Kidder as Lois Lane, Glenn Ford and Phyllis Thaxter as Jonathan and Martha Kent, and an oddly clownish Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, and Marlon Brando phoning it in as Jor-El, Superman wound up being a smash hit, raking in over $300 million on a $55 million budget. In inflation-adjusted terms, Superman's haul would be over $1.1 billion in today's money. The special effects used, the story told, and the acting that portrayed it were all good to amazing. And John Williams of Star Wars fame produced a soundtrack that was almost as iconic and as good as the one he wrote for George Lucas the previous year. And Christopher Reeve excelled in bringing the Kryptonian hero to life, while also maintaining the dichotomy between who he was as Kal-El and his guise as Clark Kent, something not all actors to don the red cape have managed. For a couple of generations, he was Superman, despite television attempts to bring the character to life with different takes and new actors, some to fairly good effect that we will hit upon in this video. The sequel released in 1980 did what few sequels ever manage: be better. Superman 2 brought back most of the main cast from the first movie, and treated audiences with the performance of seemingly always great Terrence Stamp as a properly menacing General Zod. Sarah Douglas's Ursa and Jack O'Halloran's Non rounded out the trio of Kryptonians who land on Earth to wreak havoc and kill Kal-El. Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor also returns, having escaped prison and made a deal with the Kryptonians. The story in the second film was grander, and the villains more dangerous and compelling, Hackman's Luthor being a less than intimidating figure in the first movie, even as he is outsmarting Superman. Or trying to. The story between Lois and Clark, and her reaction to finding out about his secret identity, was also nicely woven into the plot. And it was all managed while the film saw upheavals between the studio, the producers, and Richard Donner, who directed the first movie and most of the second. With most of the movie shot, the trouble came to a head and Donner was fired. In 2006, a few years after the footage from the original shoot of the first two movies was found in vaults in England, Warner Brothers approached Richard Donner to cut together an extended version of Superman 2. Originally, Donner refused, not wanting to revisit the movie and its attendant issues. There was also legal issues preventing such a project. Eventually, after finishing up commitments to other projects, Donner got on board and Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, was released. It is considered a more serious film that shows more consistency in the storytelling's tone throughout, cutting out some of the jokiness of the original. And it serves as a reminder of how good Superman 2 was, even before Richard Donner fixed it to his liking. In 1982, a lesser-known character would find its way onto the big screen in the form of Swamp Thing. Sort of. MGM, the studio producing it, only released it to direct-to-video. While not a great movie, it had an 80s camp to it, and the story was entertaining enough. It had a Darkman feel to it years before Darkman would come along, only without the dark feel to the story and film. The actors, especially Adrienne Barbeau, did a serviceable job with said story. The reception was good enough to earn it a sequel in 1989, with many of the cast returning, although Barbeau's Alice Cable did not. Instead, Heather Locklear would star as Dr. Arcane's stepdaughter. The first movie involved Dr. Alec Holland doing research in the swamps of Louisiana, and winding up getting an experimental formula splashed on him when Dr. Arcane attacks the lab. Barbeau's character is saved from being drowned in the swamp by Arcane's thugs when Swamp Thing emerges to rescue her. They eventually defeat Arcane, killing him after he used the formula to transform himself into a boar-like monster. It was full of body horror, ridiculous 80s sci-fi camp, and the low budget is obvious, but it was still stupid fun if you looked past its problems. The second movie involves a resurrected Arcane trying to create an anti-aging formula using swamp plants, animals, and even his stepdaughter. For reasons? Probably so they had an excuse to have a hottie like Locklear in the movie in skimpy outfits, though the latter is rescued by Swamp Thing before he actually defeats Arcane again. The second movie is much less entertaining than the first, lacking a certain seriousness, which is an odd thing to say when talking about a movie steeped in camp. Where Swamp Thing was good fun with a campy thread to it even as it told a serious story, Return of the Swamp Thing was just silly, and it did not even really try to tell a story with consequence. A year later, the USA Network would air a Swamp Thing show that took an entirely different track with the character. It went less camp and tried for a more serious tone that mirrored the comic book origin, though it did not follow canon, rather taking inspiration from non-comic book science fiction. Though it was not great, the show did last for 3 seasons and 72 episodes and wound up USA's highest-rated show for a time. It is also said to have much better effects and costuming. In 1983, a year after the first Swamp Thing movie, Warner Brothers decided to go back to the Superman well with Richard Lester, the man who replaced Donner on Superman 2, once more directing. Superman 3 was an abomination of a movie, treating the Superman IP not unlike present-day studios do theirs. The movie brought back the core actors, with Robert Vaughn's Ross Weber standing in for Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. We also get Annette O'Toole's Lana Lang inserted into the story as she comes to Metropolis after seeing Clark at their high school reunion, while Lois is on vacation in Bermuda. Ross Webster, the villain of the movie, decides to use a weather satellite to create a tornado to devastate Columbia's coffee crop in order to allow him to corner the market. He gets access to the satellite through Gus, a computer programmer he blackmails into helping him. The choice of person to play Gus was telling of what tone Lester wanted for the movie, since he hired comedian Richard Pryor. Gus is ordered to build a supercomputer to help Webster create an energy crisis, a computer that eventually becomes sentient. Superman winds up having a nervous breakdown due to artificial kryptonite made by Gus to prevent Superman from interfering with Webster's plan as he did when defeating the weather satellite. The faux kryptonite splits Superman into evil Superman and good Clark Kent. They fight each other and, ridiculously, Clark wins before the two halves rejoin to defeat Webster and his computer. Superman 3, as you can tell from the story, was simply silly. A poorly thought out, poorly written, and poorly executed mess. In fact, it reminds me a little of the kind of character vandalization that Disney Marvel did to Thor in Thor Love and Thunder. And the box office showed the audiences of the time did not appreciate it, bringing in only $80 million. Superman 3 was followed by an unfortunate spin-off, Supergirl. While Helen Slater made an excellent Supergirl, the movie overall suffered from terrible writing and production design that was subpar, some of which was due to the minuscule budget. The movie involved Kara Zor-El, Superman's cousin, living on an isolated Kryptonian community called Argo City that escaped the destruction of their homeworld. She is the protege of a wizard named Zoltar who shows her a powerful item called the Omega Hedron. It powers Argo City, and he borrowed it without telling anyone. Something goes wrong, and the Omega Hedron is sent flying into space. Kara gets on a spaceship to follow it to Earth, being transformed into Supergirl in the process so she can get the item back. On Earth, the Omega Hedron is found by a witch named Selena, who uses it for her own selfish ends, including giving her the powers that enable her to achieve her desires. In the process of Selena trying to capture the love of the groundskeeper Ethan at the school that Kara's new identity, Linda Lee, attends, Linda winds up rescuing him and having him fall in love with her. Selena and Supergirl fight, and Selena catches Ethan and sends Supergirl into the Phantom Zone. There, she runs into her old mentor, Zoltar. He exiled himself to the dimension for losing the Omega Hedron. He winds up sacrificing his own life to set Supergirl free. While she was in the Phantom Zone, Selena used the Omega Hedron to make herself the Princess of Earth, with Ethan as her consort. Supergirl confronts Selena, who uses the Omega Hedron to summon a shadow demon. Just as she is about to be defeated by the demon, she hears Zoltar's voice telling her to fight, and she wins, turning the demon on Selena. The demon, Selena, and Bianca, her hanger-on friend/assistant, are sucked into a portal, trapping them forever. Supergirl leaves with the Omega Hedron after Ethan professes his love to her, returning to a dark Argo City. The city lights up as the movie ends. It seemingly was an early example of what Hollywood does when trying to adapt a mostly male-oriented medium, comic books, to a female-oriented audience. It was MCU before MCU, only for DC, or DC if you will. The story was one that seemed to be written mainly for teen girls, complete with the romantic triangle and power-tripping girl boss villain. I remember seeing the film when I was younger and thinking it was alright, but it could have been so much better if the story was different. Helen Slater was beautiful, if not overly endowed, and played a serviceable Supergirl, but the setting and plot ruined her performance. Needless to say, like most of the MCU of recent years, Supergirl flopped, and flopped hard at the box office, bringing in a paltry $14.3 million on a $35 million budget. And that despite actors like Faye Dunaway, Peter O'Toole, Mia Farrow, and Peter Cook playing major roles in the movie. With a script that bad, however, the rest was inevitable. The next entry into what I like to call the teen years of DC Comics on film is another movie that was not only bad, but did a disservice to the character. 1987's Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. It was made on a $17 million budget, and it looked it. It wound up bringing in only $35 million at the box office, which means it probably actually made a little bit of money when you take rentals and video sales into account. We once more had most of the core Superman cast coming back for what wound up being one of Christopher Reeve's last major movies that was mildly successful before the accident that left him a quadriplegic in 1995. Much like Supergirl and Superman 3, Superman 4 had a stupid story that was poorly executed. It was a better watch than Superman 3, but not by much. Lex Luthor is back, and his idea this time is to defeat Superman by using a strand of Superman's hair stolen from a museum to create a genetic mix. Superman has sworn to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and he is doing so by gathering them and throwing them into the sun. Luthor sneaks his genetic experiment into one of the bundles of nukes to be thrown sunward. Nuclear Man is born, and he makes his way back to Earth to find his father, Luthor. He sends Nuclear Man to fight Superman, and during the fight he scratches Superman. Nuclear Man wins the fight, and Superman's cape falls off, making people think he might be dead. Later, Clark is shown to have fallen ill with radiation sickness from the scratches. He uses a Kryptonian energy module he found at his parents' farm to heal himself. He heads for round 2 with Nuclear Man and takes the fight to the moon. Superman once more loses, being driven into the surface on the moon. Nuclear Man goes back to Earth and kidnaps Lacey Warfield, the daughter of the new owner of the Daily Planet, and its new editor, because he is smitten with her after catching a glimpse of her previously. He carries her into space, somehow not killing her in the vacuum of outer space. Superman frees himself, pushes the moon out of orbit in order to create a total eclipse, weakening the solar-powered Nuclear Man. He rescues Lacey, returns her to Earth, unharmed, and then goes back out to recover Nuclear Man's now lifeless body. In order to dispose of him safely, he drops him into the core of a nuclear plant, powering the entire electric grid. Like Supergirl and Superman 3, Superman 4 suffered under a story that was just plain stupid. There are so many points that would need fixing that the story should never have been greenlit. It is no surprise that this is the movie that killed the Superman franchise in theaters for almost 2 decades. By this point in the franchise, even some of the actors that were still showing up in Superman 3 were obviously phoning it in by the time Superman 4 wrapped. There were no redeeming features to the movie at all. So it is mildly surprising that the very next year, audiences got a Superboy series greenlit for syndication. It was a live-action show that ran for 4 seasons and 122-minute episodes. The show was aimed at a teen audience and, like Smallville over a decade later, showed a younger Clark Kent in his first forays as a superhero while still trying to maintain his normal life as a teenager. The first 13 episodes are rather crude and more character-oriented because the producers were not sure they would get a full season order. The second half of the first season wound up with better special effects and looked worlds better. They also featured more fantastical enemies, including long-time comic book supervillain Mr. Mxyzptlk, a character with reality-warping powers and cartoonish behavior. Most people probably don't know about the series unless they saw it in its original run or are Superman fans and hunted it down. Following the cancellation of the show, it wound up in a legal dispute over who owned the rights to the IP, keeping it from being rerun or going into video sales. I already talked about both the 1989 movie The Return of Swamp Thing and the series that ran on USA from 1990 to 1993. A month after The Return of Swamp Thing was released, the box office behemoth of 1989 was released to huge fanfare. While fans of Batman in the comics did what they have done for nearly every actor cast as Batman, namely question the intelligence of those involved with the movie, Michael Keaton of Mr. Mom fame blew nearly all of them away with his turn as the Caped Crusader. Batman made $411.6 million on a $48 million budget. In inflation-adjusted numbers, that is just under $1 billion. 1989's Batman showed Hollywood just what was possible with comic book characters. Heretofore, comic book characters were limited to campy shows like the 1960s Batman or Swamp Thing, or more serious shows that did not require much in the way of special effects, like The Incredible Hulk by Marvel and Wonder Woman. Batman was dark and broody and had a depth of story and character that was missing from those earlier attempts. Michael Keaton played both Bruce Wayne and Batman with a serious, dark edge to him, something that fit right in with director Tim Burton's weird aesthetic that managed what no Batman movie or show had before, making Gotham a character in the story. The supporting cast was packed with actors at the top of their game, including Oscar winner Jack Nicholson, Oscar winner Kim Basinger, Oscar winner Jack Palance, Emmy-nominated Billy D. Williams, and BAFTA winner Michael Gough. It took the material seriously, crafted a Gotham like we have never seen outside of comic books, and made sure to populate it with characters that did the story justice. Batman became an instant classic and usurped both Linda Carter's Wonder Woman and Christopher Reeve's Superman as the prime example of how to do comic book live-action adaptations right. And they made sure to write an enthralling story that took full advantage of the high-caliber cast they managed to round up for the movie. I would go through the story, but it is surprisingly simple, despite being such a superb film. Joker takes over the criminal underworld of Gotham and decides to poison the city. Batman figures out what he did and stops him. Oh, and there's a hot girl involved that both want. I would say spoilers, but since there is a sequel to the movie, obviously Batman wins and lives. I leave the details to your viewing pleasure. It still ranks as one of the best superhero movies ever made, at least in my opinion. Next in the evolution of DC in Hollywood was the 1990 series The Flash. It only ran for one season of 22 episodes, and while it was very 90s in its look and effects, the show itself was not as bad as some previous DC attempts at live action. The show seemed to suffer from the emergence of Fox's The Simpsons and the juggernaut that was The Cosby Show and its spin-off A Different World. It also eventually landed on Saturday on the television schedule, the worst day for TV in America. The actor who played Barry Allen / The Flash in the 1990 show, John Wesley Shipp, would eventually be tapped to play Barry Allen's father, Henry, in the CW version of The Flash. Other actors from that show would also appear in the CW show. When CW decided to do an Arrowverse crossover, Shipp revised his role as The Flash and appeared again in Crisis on Infinite Earths. The 1990 show still has a following among DC fans and was likely ahead of its time in what it attempted. DC followed up the success of 1989's Batman in the summer of 1992 with another banger, a rare sequel that actually gives the original a run for its money. Batman Returns was even darker than its predecessor, which probably accounts for a lesser box office performance despite the film's quality. So dark that one of the sponsors, McDonald's, complained and wound up screwing up Batman for over a decade. This time around, the cast was just as good. Replacing Nicholson's Joker and Kim Basinger's Vicky Vale were Danny DeVito's Penguin and Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman. Christopher Walken also stars as Bruce Wayne's business rival that helps elevate the Penguin and thusly aids in his plans for the city. The story for Batman Returns is more complex than the first movie's was, which is probably part of what makes it even better and darker. Involving politics, big business, human trafficking, and high crime, the story puts Gotham in even more danger than what the Joker had planned by the end. And Tim Burton was bold enough to depict child abduction and other rather graphic acts of violence, including the Penguin biting off a man's nose. The clincher to the movie, however, was the performance of Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman, and her interplay between the once again brilliant Michael Keaton's Batman/Bruce Wayne and Christopher Walken's Max Schreck. Nobody has come even close to playing Catwoman well enough to dethrone Pfeiffer, who seemed to enjoy chewing the scenery in the very best way possible as she slinked around in her Catwoman costume. Even as weird as it seemed at the time, Danny DeVito's Penguin worked out in some strange way I have never been able to understand. He was gross and violent and without conscience, and it all worked. Even the minor characters, like those who populated the Penguin's Red Triangle gang, the image consultants for the Penguin, and Paul Rubens and Diane Salinger as the Penguin's parents, were well acted and fit into the overall aesthetic of the movie. Which is what makes it all the sadder, because Warner Brothers, who own DC, caved to pressure from McDonald's and others, and changed the tone of the next two movies. That, however, is not what came next. Also in 1992, ABC picked up Human Target as a mid-season replacement. It is a character that only comic book fans probably know. Originally shot in 1990, ABC passed on it at first, but needed something to fill the schedule in late summer 1992. It ran for 7 episodes before being axed. It was about a Vietnam veteran who used technology and sophisticated makeup to become his clients, people who were under threat of some kind. He was a bodyguard/private investigator and seemed to audiences to be too derivative of other shows, like the Mission Impossible revival and the original Quantum Leap, both of which were running and popular around the same time. The show starred successful soap opera actor and singer Rick Springfield. A year later, 1993's Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, premiered on ABC, starring Dean Cain as Clark Kent/Superman and Terry Hatcher as Lois Lane. It was extremely popular when it aired, and only dipped below 10 million viewers in the last season. The show was well written and acted, and did both the Christopher Reeve movies and the George Reeves show justice. The effects were still very 90s, but worked for the time. Dean Cain made sure to portray Clark Kent and Superman with a clear dichotomy, something not all superhero actors whose character has a secret identity manage. I will touch on the more recent The Batman star Robert Pattinson's lack of such dichotomy in another video. Dean Cain portrayed a fairly inoffensive Clark Kent and a properly heroic Superman. Terry Hatcher was gorgeous and feisty as Lois Lane. Supporting casts like Justin Whalen as Jimmy Olsen and Tracy Scoggins as Cat Grant were very good as well. And John Shea's Lex Luthor was fantastic. Shea can manage to play the most sinister villain in one project and a heroic mentor in the next. For Lois and Clark, he was properly menacing one minute while being unctuously elitist the next, and made a fantastic Lex, much better than Gene Hackman's seemingly bumbling version from the Superman movies the decade before. While the show starts out with Clark's parents witnessing his arrival in 1966, it quickly zips to present-day Metropolis, where Clark has moved after leaving Smallville in his position as editor of the Smallville Press. The rest of the story goes as most Superman stories do, and he quickly becomes partners with Lois Lane. He winds up interfering in one of Lex Luthor's plans, and Lex sees Superman as a proper opponent to shake him from his boredom. Eventually, the series brings Lois and Clark together as a couple, though not without the trials and evasions of Clark's ordeal of keeping his true identity a secret from her. They marry, though not without obstacles aplenty, and they wind up with a child left to them mysteriously. Unlike the comics, they never have a child of their own. For a DC normie, the show hit the spot with its story and its characters in a way that no show had since Linda Carter's Wonder Woman. And for many, Terry Hatcher is still our Lois Lane, and John Shea is still our Lex Luthor. The 20th century, however, did not end well for DC. Not at the movie theaters, at least. In 1995, DC treated us to the disappointment that was Batman Forever. On paper, the movie should have been good. Tim Burton left, refusing to accede to the studio's wishes for a less dark Batman iteration. Michael Keaton also left, also not liking the direction they wanted to take the character. In their place would enter Joel Schumacher of The Lost Boys and Flatliners fame as the director, and Val Kilmer would be taking up the cowl. Supporting this new Caped Crusader was Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face, Jim Carrey as the Riddler, Nicole Kidman as Dr. Chase Meridian as a psychologist and love interest, and Chris O'Donnell as Dick Grayson. On paper, that is a pretty banger cast. Alas, the story is what is largely at fault. Well, that and Joel Schumacher turning everything up to 11, and Val Kilmer not really being a good choice for someone as dark and broody as Bruce Wayne. In 1995, Kilmer was mostly known for less serious roles, though he had begun to dip his toes in the water of serious with his turn as Jim Morrison in The Doors. It also did not help that he did not really fit the look of Bruce Wayne, with his lighter colored hair and mildly pretty boy looks. But that might have been fine if Joel Schumacher wasn't trying to fit explosions and stunts into every spare frame of film, and the story was not completely retarded. And with everything turned up to 11, we also got Jim Carrey at 11, and Tommy Lee Jones at 11 too. It wound up being a farce, even if it did make a lot of money for the studio. Just not as much as the first one did. Next up would be the fourth and final Batman of the series, Batman and Robin. Much like its predecessor, Batman and Robin was dumb. 2 seconds thought about the plot will have you gushing your brains out of your nose and ears. Joel Schumacher was back to direct this quick turnaround installment, and it is something he has publicly apologized for in the past. We also got a new Batman. Apocryphal tales have hinted that Arnold Schwarzenegger refused to work with Val Kilmer. As the tale goes, he was scheduled to play Mr. Freeze, but threatened to leave the project if Kilmer remained. Kilmer, and the studio too, I believe, has always claimed that his commitment to the Island of Dr. Moreau filming meant he would not be able to meet the studio's schedule for Batman and Robin. In his place, George Clooney was cast fresh off his awesome performance in From Dusk Till Dawn, and deep into his extended stint on ER. Returning would be Chris O'Donnell, and joining them would be the aforementioned Schwarzenegger, Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy, Elle Macpherson as Bruce's girlfriend Julie Madison, and Alicia Silverstone as Barbara Wilson, Alfred's niece and later as Batgirl. As I said, the story is full-on retarded, as we have Mr. Freeze, who is stealing diamonds to power a freeze ray he is building so he can lower the temperature of the Earth in order to be able to live without his freeze suit, teaming up with Poison Ivy, who wants to cover the Earth with plants. Yeah. Throw in Poison Ivy's old scientist boss using her research to create Bane with a super soldier formula, Batgirl showing up, Alfred coincidentally dying of the same disease as Mr. Freeze's wife, and Poison Ivy deciding to use her powers to seduce Batman and Robin in order to get them fighting each other, and you can see how the story is not only a little overloaded with stupidity, contrivance, and contradictions, but is straight up retarded. And the box office showed that fans agreed. The Abomination cost somewhere between $125 and $160 million, and only brought in $238 million. This was the Batman franchise killer. Batman would not see the inside of theaters for almost a decade, and it was left to animation to keep Batman fans in supply of their favorite DC hero on TV. which most actually wound up being okay with, since the 1990s was a period of spectacular animated shows, including the definitive animated Batman series. With everything from Batman the Animated Series in the early years of the 90s to Batman Beyond in the late 90s and into the 21st century, the animated shows for both DC and Marvel exceeded most of what was offered up at theaters. And the last bomb to drop for the decade was probably the worst. In 1997, a month after Batman and Robin cratered, Warner Brothers and DC thought getting Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player, to play the superhero Steel would be a good thing to splurge $16 million on. And it looked every bit as cheap as its production budget suggests. Sadly, they managed to convince Annabeth Gish, Richard Roundtree, and Judd Nelson to join them on their moronic quest to bring a character most people have never heard of to the big screen. And they were rewarded with a $1.7 million box office haul. What was this travesty about? Shaq plays a weapons designer. Yes, a weapons designer, whose weapon winds up paralyzing his friend, Susan Sparks, played by Annabeth Gish, through the actions of one of their colleagues testing one of his weapons out. He resigns in disgust and goes home to LA. Shortly after he gets home, he witnesses a robbery in which the criminals are using his weapons. He decides to deck himself out in armor and weapons and go after both the crooks and the corrupt officer responsible for Sparks getting hurt, with Sparks' help as his controller. The officer, played by Judd Nelson, is the one selling the weapons to the criminals. Of course, he is defeated. It was $16 million that would have been better spent on something other than a vanity project for Shaq. And it represented the dismal end to the decade on television and in theaters that saw awesome highs and absolutely mind-numbingly bad lows. I call it DC's teenage years because they seemed not to know what they were doing from project to project. They were experimenting, trying to figure out how to use the blossoming technology available in both practical effects and CGI that VFX shops like Industrial Light and Magic used on movies like Jurassic Park to bring their characters to live action better. They were also learning that the fans of these projects and properties had opinions, and they would definitely make it known when you were going in the wrong direction. Unfortunately, I think Warner Brothers and their colleagues in the rest of Hollywood took the wrong lesson from being right with Michael Keaton, which is how they wound up with Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Would the new century be different? It is Hollywood. What do you think? That is all for this video. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment down below. It is all appreciated. The next part in this series should be along in a few days. Until then, tschüss.